I didn't expect anything important to happen that summer. When I signed up for the volunteer project, it was mostly because my university required community hours to graduate. Plant trees, help rebuild hiking trails, clean up a riverbank, whatever they assigned us. I just needed the credits. That's how I ended up standing in the middle of a dusty parking lot at 7 in the morning with 20 strangers and a paper cup of terrible coffee. Everyone looked half awake, dressed in mismatched work clothes and backpacks. Some people were chatting like they already knew each other. Others, like me, were scrolling through their phones pretending not to feel awkward. Then the coordinator clapped her hands. "All right, everyone. We're splitting into teams. You'll be working together for the next 3 weeks. 3 weeks. That was longer than I expected. She started reading names from a clipboard. Evan? I raised my hand. That's me. Great. You'll be with Carter. I turned instinctively, looking around to see who that was. Here, a voice said behind me. I turned and saw him. Carter was tall, probably a little taller than me, with messy dark hair and the kind of calm expression that made it seem like he'd already been awake for hours while the rest of us were still trying to remember what day it was. He gave me a small nod. Looks like we're partners. I shrugged lightly. Guess so. That was it. No dramatic moment. No spark or anything like that. Just two strangers who had been assigned the same name on a clipboard. But if you had told me then that Carter would end up changing the entire direction of my life, I probably would have laughed. Our project was rebuilding a hiking trail in a forest about an hour outside the city. The kind of place where the air smells like pine and dirt, and your phone signal disappears the second you leave the main road. The first day was chaos. People figuring out tools, arguing over maps, asking the same questions over and over. Carter and I mostly stayed quiet while the supervisor explained what we were supposed to do. Your team is responsible for this section, he said, pointing to a faded map. Clear the fallen branches, level the ground, and mark the new path. Carter studied the map for a second. Looks manageable, he said. I laughed under my breath. You say that now. He glanced at me. You don't think so? I think we're about to spend 3 weeks doing manual labor. Fair point. There was something easy about talking to him. Not forced. Not awkward. Just natural. We grabbed gloves and tools and started walking down the trail together. At first, the conversation was basic. Where are you from? What do you study? Why did you sign up for this? Architecture, Carter said when I asked about his major. That explains the map skills. He smirked. And you? Environmental science. Ah, he nodded. So you actually care about what we're doing? I mean, I said, lifting a heavy branch off the path. A little. He laughed quietly. By the time we reached our assigned section of trail, the rest of the team had already scattered across the forest. For a moment, it was just the two of us standing there. All right, Carter said, rolling up his sleeves. Where do we start? I pointed to a pile of branches blocking the path. Probably there. We worked for hours. Dragging wood, clearing rocks, marking the ground with spray paint where the new trail would go. It was exhausting. But something about it felt good too. No phones. No deadlines. Just a clear task and someone working beside you. At one point Carter wiped sweat from his forehead and looked at the half-cleared path. Not bad for day one. I followed his gaze. Yeah, I said. Then I added, without really thinking. We make a pretty good team. He looked at me for a second, like the comment surprised him. Then he smiled. Yeah, he said. We do. Over the next few days, Carter and I fell into a rhythm. We met at the bus every morning, grabbed coffee from the same little stand near the parking lot, and walked to our section of the trail together. The work got easier once we figured out how to divide it. He handled the layout and measurements. I focused on clearing and leveling the ground. Sometimes we talked while we worked. Sometimes we didn't. But even the silence felt comfortable. On the fourth day, We were taking a break sitting on a fallen log when Carter said something unexpected. You know what's weird? What? I usually hate group projects. I laughed. Same. Too many people, he continued. Too many opinions. So what makes this different? He looked at me thoughtful. Honestly? Yeah. He shrugged. I think it's just easier when it's you. I wasn't sure why that sentence stayed with me. But it did. Maybe because I felt the same way. The project coordinators started noticing our progress pretty quickly. One afternoon, the supervisor walked down the trail to check on us. He looked around at the cleared section, the marked path, the small wooden steps we built into a steep slope. Well, he said, impressed. Carter wiped his hands on his jeans. Is that good or bad? It's good, the supervisor said. Very good. Then he looked between us. You two work well together. Carter glanced at me. I shrugged. We try. The supervisor nodded approvingly before heading back up the trail. For a moment we just stood there in the quiet forest. Then Carter said something softly. Guess we're officially a team now. I smiled. Looks like it. At the time, I thought he meant the project. I didn't realize yet how much bigger that sentence would become. The first moment things felt different happened about a week into the project. We had stayed later than everyone else to finish reinforcing a steep section of the trail. By the time we packed up our tools, the forest was quiet. Most of the other volunteers had already left. Great, I said, checking my phone. What? We missed the bus. Carter looked up the hill toward the empty parking lot. Seriously? Seriously. For a second we just stood there. Then he laughed. Well, I guess we're walking. I groaned. The road back to town was long, but it wasn't terrible. We walked side by side, the evening air cool after the heat of the day. For a while either of us said much. Then Carter glanced at me. You know something? What? I'm kind of glad we missed it. Why? He shrugged. More time to talk. I smiled a little. Yeah, I said. Same. And somewhere during that long walk back to town, something between us quietly started to change. The walk back to town after we missed the bus became a strange turning point for Carter and me. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just different. The road from the forest curved along a quiet stretch of fields, and the sun was already starting to dip lower in the sky. Everything was that soft orange color that only shows up right before evening. Carter kicked a small rock along the pavement as we walked. You think they'll fire us for missing the bus? He asked. I laughed. Pretty sure this isn't that kind of volunteer program. Good, he said. Because I'm actually starting to enjoy this. You? Enjoying manual labor? Careful, he replied. I'm still an architecture student. I'm allowed to appreciate construction. I nudged his shoulder lightly. You spend most of the day measuring things. That's the important part, he said seriously. You're the one doing the heavy lifting. Yeah? He smiled. For a while we just walked in comfortable silence again. Then he asked something that caught me off guard. So, why environmental science? I looked at the road ahead. My dad works in forestry, I said after a second. I grew up around forests like that one. Explains why you look so calm out there, Carter said. What about you? He thought for a moment. I like building things that last, he said simply. There was something about the way he said it quiet, thoughtful that made the sentence feel bigger than it sounded. Buildings? I asked. Or spaces, he replied. Places people actually want to be. I nodded slowly. That's a good reason. He glanced at me. Yeah? Yeah. Then he said something that made my chest feel strangely warm. I think you'd like the buildings I design. I raised an eyebrow. Confident. He shrugged. I just mean, you seem like someone who notices details. I laughed softly. You've known me for a week. Still counts. After that night, Carter and I started spending time together even outside the project. At first, it happened naturally. The volunteer group would grab food after work, and we'd end up sitting next to each other. Or we'd arrive early and wait for the others near the bus stop. One morning he handed me a coffee before I could even order one. "You remembered my order?" I asked. "You've ordered the same thing every day," he said. "Still impressive." He smiled slightly. "I pay attention." For some reason that sentence stayed with me all day. About halfway through the project, the coordinators decided to organize a small campfire night for the volunteers. Nothing fancy. Just a fire pit, some food, and people sitting around talking after work. The forest looked completely different at night. The trees felt taller. The air cooler. Carter and I ended up sitting on a log near the edge of the group, while everyone else talked loudly around the fire. Someone passed us marshmallows. Carter held one up. "You any good at this? Roasting marshmallows?" "Yeah. Obviously," I said. "It's a survival skill." He laughed quietly. For a while we watched the fire in silence. Then he said something unexpected. "You know what I like about this project?" "What?" "Everyone showed up for different reasons." I looked at him. And somehow we all ended up building the same thing." I followed his gaze toward the dark outline of the trail disappearing into the trees. "That's kind of nice," I said. He nodded. Then he looked back at me. "Also, I'm glad I got paired with you." I felt my stomach do something strange. "Yeah? Yeah." I didn't know what to say to that. So I just smiled. The next morning something small happened that made me realize how much things had shifted. I arrived at the bus stop and Carter was already there. But he wasn't looking at his phone like everyone else. He was watching the road. Waiting. When he saw me, he immediately relaxed. "You're late," he said. "It's been 2 minutes. Still counts." "You were worried?" He shrugged casually. "Maybe." That answer was way too honest. And somehow, I liked it. Our section of the trail was almost finished by the second week. The wooden steps were secure, the path was level, and the markers were placed all the way to the river bend. One afternoon the supervisor came to check our progress again. He walked slowly along the trail, examining everything carefully. Finally he turned back to us. "This might be the best section on the entire route," he said. Carter glanced at me. I raised my eyebrows like, did he really just say that? The supervisor nodded approvingly. "You two make a very effective team." Carter smiled. "We've heard that before." When the supervisor left, we stood there looking at the finished trail. For a moment neither of us said anything. Then Carter said quietly, "It's weird." "What?" "That this will probably still be here in 10 years. I looked down the path we had built together. People would walk it, hike it, maybe never even think about who built it." "Yeah," I said. "It's kind of cool." He nodded slowly. Then he looked at me again. "You know, when this project ends, it's going to feel strange not seeing you every day." The sentence landed softly between us. I tried to play it cool. "Yeah," I said. "Same." But the truth was, the thought had already crossed my mind too. And I wasn't sure I liked the idea of that routine disappearing. A few days later something happened that made everything between us feel a little more real. It was late afternoon, and we were packing up tools when Carter suddenly sat down on a rock. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, rubbing his neck. "Just tired." We had been working for hours in the heat. So I sat down next to him. For a moment we just breathed, listening to the quiet forest around us. Then Carter leaned back slightly and said something almost absent-mindedly. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "When this started I thought this was going to be the most boring 3 weeks of my life." I laughed. "And now?" He turned his head and looked directly at me. "Now it's the best part of my summer." The way he said it was simple, honest. And suddenly the air between us felt a little heavier. I wasn't sure what to do with that feeling. So I just said the only thing that felt true. Yeah, I said. Mine too. But neither of us realized yet that the hardest part of the project wasn't the work. It was the fact that it was slowly coming to an end. And neither of us had figured out what would happen after. By the start of the third week, the project had changed for me in ways I didn't expect. Not because of the work. Because of Carter. Somewhere between clearing fallen branches, long walks back to the bus stop, and quiet conversations during breaks, he had become the person I automatically looked for every morning. If he wasn't at the bus stop yet, something felt off. If he arrived before me, he always noticed immediately. We never talked about it. But the routine had quietly formed around us. One morning I showed up later than usual. The bus engine was already running and people were climbing inside. Carter was standing near the door, scanning the sidewalk. When he saw me jogging toward the bus, his shoulders visibly relaxed. "You almost missed it," he said as I climbed on. "Almost," I replied, catching my breath. He shook his head. "You're lucky I stalled the driver." "You what?" I asked him 3 questions about the trail route. I laughed. "You didn't." He smiled. "Maybe." We took our usual seats near the back. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I nudged his shoulder. "You know that means you're officially responsible for me now." "Oh? Yeah. You delayed public transportation." He nodded thoughtfully. "Worth it." The way he said it was quiet. But it stayed with me the entire ride. That day we were finishing the last stretch of the trail near the river. The path curved along the water, and the sunlight reflected off the surface in bright flashes. It was probably the nicest part of the whole route. Carter studied the ground for a while, measuring distances with the tape line. "All right," he said finally. "What?" "I think we're done." I looked down the trail. The ground was smooth. The markers were placed evenly. The wooden steps behind us connected perfectly with the new section. It actually looked like a real hiking trail now. "We did that," I said quietly. Carter followed my gaze. "Yeah," he replied. "We did." For a moment we just stood there, taking it in. Then he said something softer. "It's weird finishing something like this." "Why?" "Because now there's nothing left to fix." I looked at him. "And that's bad?" He shrugged slightly. "It just means the project is over." There it was. The thing neither of us had really said out loud yet. 3 weeks were almost up. That afternoon the entire volunteer group gathered near the parking lot. The coordinator gave a short speech thanking everyone for their work. People clapped. Some volunteers exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch. Carter and I stood next to each other near the back of the group. Neither of us said much. Finally he glanced at me. "So, tomorrow's the last day." "Yeah." He kicked a small stone near his shoe. "Feels fast." "Really fast." There was a pause. Then he said something carefully. "You heading straight home after?" "Probably," I said. "You?" "Same." Another silence. The kind where both people feel like something should be said, but no one knows how to start. Finally Carter rubbed the back of his neck. "You know, it'd be weird if we just stopped talking after this." I looked at him. "Yeah," I said. "That would be weird." He nodded slowly. "Good." Then he added, almost casually, "So we won't." The last day of the project was strange. Everyone was relaxed, like the pressure was gone. Some volunteers were taking photos near the trail entrance. Others were signing the small wooden board the coordinators had placed near the start of the path. A marker was passed around so people could write their names. When it reached Carter, he hesitated. Then he wrote something under the list of volunteers. I leaned over to read it. "Trail section, Carter and Evan." I smiled. Confident. He handed me the marker. "Your turn." So underneath his writing, I added a small line. "Best team on the project." He read it and laughed quietly. "Now that's confident." "Just telling the truth." Later that afternoon, the buses arrived to take everyone back to the city one last time. People were hugging, saying goodbye, promising to meet again. Carter and I stood near the same spot where we had first met 3 weeks earlier. Neither of us seemed eager to get on the bus. Finally, he said, "This feels like the end of something." I nodded. "Yeah." Then I added, "But maybe it doesn't have to be." He looked at me, curious. "What do you mean?" I shrugged slightly. "I mean, we live in the same city." "That's true. We survived 3 weeks of manual labor together." "Also true. So getting coffee sometimes shouldn't be that hard." For a moment, Carter just looked at me. Then he smiled. The same quiet smile he'd given me the first day. "I'd like that," he said. "Yeah? Yeah." The bus doors opened behind us. People started climbing inside. Carter nodded toward it. "Come on," he said. "We probably shouldn't miss another one." I laughed. "Fair." But this time, when we sat down next to each other, the ride felt different. Because now we both knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just a moment where something new was about to start. The strange thing about finishing the volunteer project was how quickly normal life tried to take its place again. Classes started. People disappeared back into their routines. The forest trail, the bus rides, the long afternoons of clearing branches, it all began to feel like something that had happened months ago instead of just a few days. But Carter didn't disappear. 2 days after the project ended, I got a message. "Carter, coffee's still a good idea?" I stared at the text longer than I should have. Then I typed back. "Me. Yeah. Definitely." We agreed to meet at a small cafe near campus. The kind of place with big windows, plants everywhere, and music that was always a little too soft to identify. I arrived first. And for a moment I wondered if things would feel awkward outside the project. In the forest, everything had been simple. Tasks. Schedules. A clear reason to be there. Now it was just us. Then Carter walked in. And the second he spotted me, he smiled like he just found something familiar in a crowded room. "Hey," he said, sitting down across from me. "Hey." For a moment we both laughed a little. "What?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "This feels weird." "Yeah," he admitted. Then he added, "But good weird." I nodded. "Yeah." We talked for almost 2 hours. About classes. About what we'd been doing since the project ended. About how strange it felt not waking up early for the bus anymore. "At least I don't miss the tools," Carter said. "You loved the measuring tape." "I tolerated the measuring tape." I smiled. Then he leaned back in his chair slightly. "You know what I do miss?" "What?" "The routine." "Same," I admitted. "Seeing the trail change every day," he continued. "Yeah. And seeing you every day." He said it casually. But the sentence landed heavier than the others. I tried to keep my voice normal. "Well," I said, "that part is still possible." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Yeah. People see their friends more than once every 3 weeks. "Friends," he repeated thoughtfully. I immediately felt my face warm a little. "Yeah," I said. He studied me for a second. Then he smiled again. "I like that." After that day, meeting up started happening naturally. Sometimes it was coffee. Sometimes it was grabbing food after class. Once we walked through a park for almost 2 hours just talking. I started noticing small things about Carter I hadn't seen during the project. He always noticed architecture when we passed buildings. "See that balcony?" he'd say. "What about it?" "The angle's wrong. Rainwater will collect there." "You notice that stuff everywhere?" "Unfortunately." He also had this quiet sense of humor that only showed up when he felt comfortable. One afternoon I complained about a long lab report. "Tragic," he said. "You're studying architecture. You draw buildings. That's incredibly reductive. Am I wrong?" He thought about it. "No. But the more time we spent together, the more I noticed something else. There were moments where conversations slowed down, where we'd look at each other for a little too long, where the space between us felt slightly charged in a way I didn't quite understand. One evening we were walking across campus after grabbing dinner. The sky was turning dark, and the lights along the paths were starting to turn on. Carter had his hands in his pockets, walking beside me quietly. "You know what's funny?" he said suddenly. "What?" "If someone had told me 3 weeks ago that I'd still be hanging out with someone from a volunteer project this much, you'd be surprised?" "Very." I smiled. "Regret signing up?" He looked at me immediately. "Not even a little." Then he added softer, "It was the best decision I made this summer." Something about the way he said it made my chest feel tight in a good way. A week later we decided to visit the trail again. Not for work. Just to see it finished. The forest looked different without tools and equipment everywhere. Quieter. The path we built stretched smoothly through the trees. Carter walked slowly along the section we had worked on. "Still holding up," he said. "Of course it is." He glanced at me. "Best team on the project, remember?" I laughed. "Right." We reached the river bend where the trail ended. For a moment we just stood there listening to the water. Then Carter said something quietly. "I'm glad we didn't just say goodbye that day." "Me too." He looked at me. There was something thoughtful in his expression, like he was deciding whether to say something else. Finally he asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." He hesitated. Then he said, "When we first met, did you expect we'd still be doing this?" I shook my head. "Not even close." He smiled slightly. "Same." There was a pause. Then he added something softer. "But I'm really glad we are." Standing there near the river, something between us shifted again. Not dramatically. Just enough to make the moment feel important. Neither of us moved for a few seconds. Then Carter said quietly, "You know what's strange?" "What?" "This whole thing started because someone randomly put our names together." I smiled. "Yeah." He looked at the trail behind us. "Best random decision ever." I laughed. "Definitely." But as we started walking back down the path together, I realized something. This no longer felt like a volunteer project memory. It felt like the beginning of something neither of us had fully named yet. And I had a feeling Carter was starting to realize that too. After we visited the trail again, something between Carter and me became impossible to ignore. Not in a dramatic way. There was no big moment where one of us suddenly said this is happening. It was more like a slow shift. Conversations lasted longer. Goodbyes took a little more time. And every time we met, it felt a little more natural than the last. A few days after the trail visit, Carter texted me again. "Carter, you busy tonight?" I looked at the message while sitting in my apartment. "Me? Not really." "Why?" 3 dots appeared immediately. "Carter, I found something you might like." That was vague. "Me? That sounds suspicious." A moment later another message appeared. "Carter, trust me." An hour later we were walking through a quiet street near the architecture district downtown. I looked around. "Okay," I said. "What exactly did you find?" Carter pointed ahead. At first I didn't see anything unusual. Then we reached the corner. And suddenly I understood. It was a small rooftop garden above a modern building open to the public, but mostly empty at night. Plants lined the edges. Wooden benches faced the city skyline. Lights from the buildings reflected off the glass walls around us. I looked at Carter. "You brought me here because of the plants, didn't you?" He crossed his arms. "Maybe. You know me too well." He smiled. "That's the idea." We sat on one of the benches overlooking the city. Cars moved far below us. The air was cool and quiet. For a while we just talked like we always did. Classes. Random stories. The terrible coffee from the volunteer project. But eventually the conversation slowed down. and the silence between us felt different than usual. Not uncomfortable, just heavier. Carter leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know," he said quietly, "I keep thinking about something." "What?" "That last day of the project." I looked at him. "Why?" He shrugged a little. "I almost didn't ask for coffee." That surprised me. "Really?" "Yeah." "Why not?" He thought for a second. "Because I wasn't sure if you felt the same way I did." I frowned slightly. "What way?" He looked up at me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then he said it plainly. "Like I didn't want to stop seeing you." My chest tightened. "I didn't want that either," I admitted. "Yeah?" "Yeah." He studied my face for a second, like he was confirming something he had been wondering about for weeks. Then he leaned back against the bench. "Good," he said quietly. We stayed on that rooftop longer than we planned. The city slowly grew quieter. The lights from the buildings reflected in Carter's eyes when he looked at me. At one point he said something that caught me off guard. "You're easy to be around." I laughed softly. "That's a strange compliment." "I mean it in a good way." I figured. He turned toward me slightly. "I don't feel like I have to perform around you." "Perform?" "Yeah. You know, act like someone else." I shook my head. "You've never seemed like that kind of person." "Maybe not with you," he said. There was something honest about the way he said it. And suddenly the moment felt more serious than anything we had talked about before. After a while we stood up to leave. The rooftop lights flickered slightly as the building prepared to close for the night. We walked toward the elevator together. And for some reason neither of us seemed eager to rush the moment. When the elevator doors opened, we stepped inside. The small space felt strangely quiet. Carter leaned against the wall. I stood next to him. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then he looked at me again. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "That volunteer project accidentally gave me something I didn't expect." "What's that?" He smiled slightly. "You." The elevator stopped at the ground floor. The doors opened. But neither of us moved immediately. For a moment we just looked at each other. And something about the way Carter was looking at me made it clear that the line between friendship and something more had already disappeared. Finally he said quietly, "Walk you home?" I nodded. "Yeah." And as we stepped out into the cool night air together, I realized something. We hadn't officially said anything yet. But somehow we were already becoming more than just teammates. The walk home after the rooftop felt different from any other time Carter and I had spent together. Not awkward. Not rushed. Just quiet in a way that made every small moment feel noticeable. The streets were mostly empty, and the air had that cool night feeling that shows up after a long summer day. Carter walked beside me with his hands in his jacket pockets. For a while neither of us said anything. Finally he broke the silence. "You're thinking about something." I glanced at him. "How do you know?" "You get this look," he said. "Like you're halfway in a conversation with yourself." I laughed quietly. "Maybe." "So?" he asked. "So what? What's the conversation about?" I hesitated for a moment. Then I decided to be honest. "I was thinking about how weird it is that we almost didn't meet." He tilted his head slightly. "You mean if we signed up for different projects? Or if they paired us with different people?" "True," he said. We walked a few more steps before he added, "That would have been a mistake." I looked at him. "Yeah?" "Yeah." When we reached my apartment building, we stopped near the entrance. This part always felt a little strange. The moment where one of us had to say goodnight. Usually it was simple. But tonight it felt heavier. Carter looked up at the building. "So this is you?" "Yeah." There was a short pause. Then he rubbed the back of his neck slightly. "You know, I've been thinking about something." "What?" "About earlier." "The rooftop?" He nodded. "I meant what I said." "About what?" About not wanting to stop seeing you. I leaned against the railing beside the door. You don't have to stop. I know, he said. But I meant it in a bigger way than just hanging out. The words hung in the air between us. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I asked quietly, what kind of way? Carter met my eyes. The kind where this isn't just two people who met on a project anymore. My heart started beating faster. You mean? He smiled slightly. Yeah. For a moment I just looked at him. Not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to be sure. Then I said the only thing that felt right. I was hoping you meant that. Something in Carter's expression relaxed immediately. Good, he said softly. Neither of us rushed the moment. We just stood there near the building entrance for a while, talking quietly about nothing important. Eventually Carter stepped a little closer. Not dramatically. Just enough that the space between us disappeared. You know, he said, I've been replaying the last few weeks in my head. Why? Because it's strange how natural it felt. The project? No, he said. This. I understood what he meant. Yeah, I said. It did. For a moment we just looked at each other. Then Carter reached out and pulled me into a quick hug. It wasn't dramatic or intense. Just warm. Simple. The kind of hug that felt like confirmation. When he stepped back, he smiled again. So, he said. So? I replied. Does this mean I can see you again tomorrow? I laughed. You saw me today. And? You're impatient. Very. I thought about it for a second. Then I nodded. Yeah, I said. Tomorrow works. The next few weeks felt different. Not because our lives suddenly changed. Classes were still busy. Assignments still piled up. But Carter had quietly become part of my everyday routine. Sometimes he'd show up outside my building with coffee. Sometimes we studied together at the library. Sometimes we just walked around campus talking about nothing. It felt natural. Like the same teamwork we had on the trail had simply turned into something else. One afternoon, while we were sitting near the campus fountain, Carter leaned back on the bench and looked at me thoughtfully. You know what I realized? What? That volunteer project accidentally created the most effective team I've ever been on. I smiled. Still confident, I see. I'm serious, he said. Me too. Then he added quietly. Except now it's not just a team. What is it then? He thought for a moment. Then he said, something better. And honestly, he was right. Because what started as two strangers assigned to the same trail had turned into something neither of us expected. Not just teammates. Not just friends. Something that kept growing every time we spent another day together. And for the first time since that first morning in the dusty parking lot, I realized something important. That random volunteer project hadn't just given us a trail that would last for years. It had given both of us a person we didn't plan on meeting. And somehow, we had become a team in a much bigger way than either of us imagined. A few months after the volunteer project, Carter and I went back to the trail again. This time it wasn't planned weeks in advance. It just happened. We were sitting in a campus cafe after a long afternoon of studying when Carter suddenly said, You want to do something tomorrow? Depends, I said. Is it another rooftop garden? He smiled. No. Something better. What? Let's go see the trail again. The next morning we drove out of the city early. The same forest road looked exactly the way I remembered it from the project. Tall trees, quiet air, the smell of pine everywhere. But this time there were no volunteers. No tools. No schedules. Just the two of us walking down the trail we had built months earlier. Carter stepped onto the first wooden platform we had constructed and looked down the path. Still holding up, he said. Of course it is, I replied. Best section on the route. He laughed. Confident. You started it. We continued walking until we reached the river bend where our section ended. A couple of hikers passed us on the path. One of them paused and looked down the trail. "This part is really well built," the guy said to his friend. They kept walking. Carter and I exchanged a quiet look. Neither of us said anything, but the moment felt oddly satisfying. We sat down on the same rock near the water where we had taken breaks during the project. The river moved slowly past us, reflecting sunlight through the trees. For a while we just listened to the water. Then Carter said something quietly. "You ever think about how random this was?" "What?" "Us meeting. All the time," I admitted. "If they had paired us with different people, we probably never would have talked," he finished. "Yeah." He picked up a small stick and tossed it lightly into the water. "Best random decision someone else ever made." I smiled. "Agreed." After a few minutes, Carter stood up and stretched slightly. "Come on," he said. "Where?" "I want to show you something." We walked a little further down the trail until we reached the wooden sign near the entrance. The same one where all the volunteers had written their names on the final day. The writing was still there, faded slightly from weather, but still readable. Carter pointed to the section where he had written, "Trail section, Carter and Evan." Underneath it was my line, "Best team on the project." I laughed quietly. "I forgot about that." He crossed his arms and looked at the sign for a moment. Then he said something softly. "You know, that turned out to be more true than we thought." I looked at him. "How?" He smiled slightly. "Because we didn't stop being a team when the project ended." He was right. The project ended months ago. But Carter had become part of my life in a way that felt permanent. Like something that had quietly built itself over time, just like the trail. We started walking back toward the parking lot. The forest was peaceful in the late afternoon light. Halfway up the trail, Carter slowed down. "Hey," he said. "What? You remember the first day? The parking lot?" "Yeah." I nodded. "You looked like you didn't want to be there." "I didn't," I admitted. He laughed. "I'm glad you stayed." "Me too." Then he added something softly. "Because otherwise I wouldn't have met the best teammate I've ever had." I bumped his shoulder lightly. "Careful. Your confidence is showing again." He grinned. "Not confidence." "What then?" He looked at me. "Just telling the truth." When we reached the parking lot, Carter paused before unlocking the car. "You know something?" he said. "What?" "I signed up for that volunteer project because I needed the hours to graduate." I laughed. "Same. But I ended up getting something way better." "What?" He gestured between us. "This." I nodded slowly. "Yeah. Because sometimes the best things in life start with something simple. A random name on a list. A shared project. A long walk after missing the bus. And somehow, without planning it, two strangers become a team that lasts far longer than the project ever did."